Hi there! In this video I'm going to talk about the contents and the benefits of this course. If you are using Oracle SQL in somewhere, you can use PL/SQL too, because they work together since Oracle database has both by default. And if you can use SQL plus PL/SQL, you are much more valuable than your friends. Actually, I don't want to mention so much about the value of PL/SQL. If you work with SQL, you know that already. Let's talk about the content. In this course, you will learn everything about PL/SQL in depth with all examples. So what are these contents? First, you will see how to set up the environment for PL/SQL, database installation, and SQL developer setup. Then we will start with what is PL/SQL and why PL/SQL. You will learn how important it is. You will learn the architecture of PL/SQL. You need to know what you are dealing with. This will help you to learn PL/SQL easier and use it more efficient. Then we will start with writing our first simplest code. Now we need to know the variables to store and manipulate data easily. After that, you will learn how to use the control structures, if clauses, loops, etc. The standard things like in every programming language. Now we are ready to deal with data. You will learn how to add, use and modify data with using SQL plus PL/SQL. Then you will learn maybe the most used structure, cursors. You will walk through about data one by one. Then the power of a programming language, functions, procedures, and packages. Then you will learn how to deal with errors with using exceptions. Now you need to learn how to debug your program to inspect unexpected errors. This is extremely useful. Then a great power. You will learn how to create a dynamic SQL. This is what you expect from an SQL query, but you cannot find. Then composite data types. This is what you know as arrays, collections, etc. in other programming languages. Now, something really good. You will learn how to use PL/SQL like an object-oriented programming. Then you will learn triggers. Triggers are what you will need in every day of your programming life. You will be able to control the data now. Then some great packages that will ease your business and code, Oracle supplied packages. Then you will learn how to use PL/SQL compiler. This is something to make you different. Then you will learn how to deal with large objects like files, images, etc. And the performance and tuning. You will learn how to write perfect codes, or you will be able to tune your friends' codes. Pretty cool. Then a really advanced thing, result caching. Now you need to know how to secure your code and data. Then a pretty helpful subject, hints. Then the dependencies of objects in PL/SQL. Then you will learn how to add more power to PL/SQL using Java and C in PL/SQL. You will find much more subjects about PL/SQL in the last section. Basically, you will learn more than everything about PL/SQL with many examples, quizzes, and materials. What you need to do is just get inside and advance your career. Hi, in this lecture you will see what to know before starting the course. Especially if you are new in Udemy, these tips will be very useful to get the most out of this course. First of all, if English is not your first language, or if you are having some problems to understand what I am saying, there are two options to handle that. First, if you are having a problem with the speed of the lecture, you can change it by clicking on the speed button here and select a faster or a slower speed. Because as human beings, example, I'm sorry to say that, but you need to know that PL/SQL is not a display language. That means you cannot create visual things with PL/SQL. It is developed for business operations or handling some complicated logic with strong logic control statements. Besides, you can do some after SQL statements like logs, controls like constraints, some security things, and reusability with store procedures. Why not the others? Actually, on the visual parts, you need to use other programming languages. Oracle also has some tools or languages for creating visual screens or reports, etc. You know the others already. Can you do these logics with Java, for example, or .NET? Yes, most probably you can do the same things with another language. So why you should choose PL/SQL then? Since PL/SQL works in database, it will be much faster than the other languages in this area. Besides, the other languages are not created for just data, But PL/SQL is created for only data manipulation and for only Oracle database and by Oracle itself. This makes PL/SQL really strong than the others on its own area. And there are some built-in functions that you cannot find in other programming languages. These functions are really helpful on your business. Also, since it works in the same database engine, there is so less network loss than the others. This also increases performance. Besides, there are its own methods to increase performance like bulk insert, etc. To sum up, like all the programming languages, PL/SQL has also pros and cons for all programming languages to the others. If you need to manipulate some data, use PL/SQL as much as you can. If you are using Oracle SQL in any programming language, any tool, or simply any environment, knowledge of PL/SQL will give you a huge advantage against those who doesn't know it. PL/SQL will provide you the power to make your applications more efficient, more robust, and more secure. So, I think this is enough to say why to choose PL/SQL programming language. Actually, most of you will need to use because your company wants you to know that. But for the people who says why to choose, I can say that if you are using Oracle SQL already, and if you know PL/SQL too, you will be better than your friends in your job and you will be paid more. So this is the end of this lesson. See you in the next lessons. Hi. In this lesson, we are going to talk about PL/SQL architecture. Actually, we simply mentioned about the architecture of PL/SQL, but in this lesson, I want to go some deeper parts of the architecture. Why do we need to know this architecture? Sometimes it's really important to know PL/SQL architecture to improve performance. If you know how it works, you use it better. We will see this in our forward sections, especially in performance sections. We can think the architecture in two parts, physical architecture and logical architecture. Let's start with the physical architecture then. Let's remember our previous PL/SQL engine schema first. In Oracle database, there is an SQL engine that operates your SQL queries and returns data to the client. In this engine, there is a SQL statement executor, that's here, which operates your queries. What do I mean with this operator? When you write your SQL query, it does not run directly. There are some operations before your query is interpreted. These are DBA subjects I will mention a bit now. When we run our query, it steps into three main processes: parsing, fetching, and executing. This operation is done by the SQL engine. We should know that Oracle knows how our query works best and better than us. So when you run your query, SQL Optimizer optimizes your query. For example, if you did some joins with standard joins, it turns them into Oracle's join types. There is an optimization level. It optimizes your query based on which optimization level you selected. If you check SQL tuning subjects or DBA subjects, you will find much more about what SQL engine does before it runs your query. All your SQL operations are done in SQL engine. SQL statement executor does these operations: insert, updates, deletes, query returns, etc. PL/SQL engine is a bit more complicated. Now we know that your PL/SQL is generally cooperates with SQL engine. That means if you do an SQL thing, this part is handled by SQL engine. For example, if you have any DML operations inside your PL/SQL code, it is sent to the SQL engine. And your DMLs are done in here. After these DML operations, the result is returned to PL/SQL engine, as we can see this arrow. If you query from a table, your result is returned to PL/SQL engine, then your PL/SQL code can do any programmatically operations in PL/SQL engine. Let's continue with the logical architecture. Let's open up a bit how PL/SQL works. Cooperates with SQL engine. As I said now, PL/SQL tightly integrated with SQL. That means even SQL is a different language. While you are coding with PL/SQL and SQL together, you will feel like you are coding with one language. The reason is PL/SQL codes resembles with the SQL codes. For example, when you are coding with Java and SQL, these two languages are completely different with each other. But you will see that PL/SQL is just like the next step of SQL. PL/SQL engine allows us to create, manage, and execute SQL and PL/SQL codes and interact with the database. If you write an SQL code inside your PL/SQL codes, it will call the SQL engine and have this operation done with SQL engine. Then the result is sent back to the PL/SQL engine. This operation is called as context switches. One engine to another and the opposite is valid. This operation is so fast that you will not easily understand. But if your code needs too much context switches, then you may have performance issues. But don't worry, there are some advanced PL/SQL methodologies to handle this, and I will teach you all these in this course. Enables subprograms. When you start programming, the most frequent problem is, how can I save this script and run again and again, instead of copy-paste all the time? Copy-paste is very boring and your code will be so ugly with unnecessary repeated codes. PL/SQL enables us to save and reuse our codes, and this really helps. By the way, you may have already know what is subprograms, variables, etc., the main things, but some students may not know, so I am trying to explain with so brief and instructive way. Anyway, PL/SQL has so powerful subprogram techniques that will help you in all the business logic of your work. These programs can be shared with other users so we can use them like a library. And dynamic queries. PL/SQL enables us to create dynamic queries upon your program. You can either change the where clause of your query based on your variables, or you can completely create a new SQL query and run it with PL/SQL. And case insensitivity. PL/SQL is a case-insensitive programming language, but I recommend you to use some rules on writing your code for readability and understandability. You can either use your own rules or follow Oracle's naming or coding styles. That will be your choice. This will not affect anything in your program. I sometimes will inform you about the style of Oracle's recommendations. And optimizer. There is an SQL optimizer in Oracle. PL/SQL has its own optimizer too. Many times, our code will not be designed so good for performance. Oracle offers us an option to optimize our code. We can select the optimization level and it will basically or deeply optimize our code. Optimize means changing our code before it runs with the best way of performance. We will see how to optimize our code by ourselves and by letting it to be done by the software in our next chapters. So let's continue now. Enables object-oriented programming. It enables object-oriented programming with abstract data types. We will see how to do this in our next chapters. And web development. You can even develop web applications. You can use PL/SQL Gateway and the PL/SQL Web Toolkit to create a new web-based applications. Actually, I don't think that you will ever need to create a web application with using PL/SQL. There are many other languages that does this operation with more sufficient and faster ways. And your company will have the ability or platform to run these languages, at least one of these. So I'm not planning to teach this subject in this course. It will be unnecessary for you. So let's pass the other one. Actually, we will frequently mention about the logical structure of PL/SQL in our next chapters in detail, but I tried to explain a bit before you start with adding some benefits of this language. I hope you learned something. If you could not understand, don't worry. We will mention all these with more details in our next lessons, because this is a huge architecture. This was just an intro before you start. So this is the end of the architecture of PL/SQL lessons. See you in our next lessons. Hi, in this lecture we will talk about the schema used in this course. But first, let's start with what is a schema. We can think of a schema as a user in our database. In Oracle database, since each user must have a schema, we can consider schemas as users. But technically, schemas are the collections of objects for each user in the Oracle database. All the objects of a single user are collected under a logical set schema. Every user has objects under their schemas, and a user does not have anything more than their schema has. Besides, a user can have only one schema, so we simply call schemas as users. So what is HR schema? HR, which is the abbreviation of human resources, is the schema that we will do our practices on, is also a user and a schema in our database which is created before by Oracle. This schema is the most well-known and most commonly used test schema in Oracle database trainings, because this one is prepared with lots of data, just like how the companies do. Like the other schemas, this schema has some objects like tables, views, triggers, constraints, etc. that we are going to use most of them in our lessons. Alright, of course, we will see almost all the objects in this schema in our course, but for now, the most important objects of it are the tables. Great. Now let's look at the tables in HR schema and the relations between them. This kind of schema design is called as Entity Relationship Diagram, shortly abbreviated as ER diagram. This diagram shows the tables and the relationships between them. Alright, we can say that relational database management systems are formed of tables like these. These tables are stored as tabular forms like the Excel spreadsheets. I have shown you examples of it in the previous lectures. These capital texts are the names of the tables. Tables are formed of columns, and these lowercase names are the names of the columns of tables. As I said before, HR stands for Human Resources. It has 7 tables. They are employees, departments, locations, countries, regions, job history, and jobs tables. Actually, you can easily understand what is there in these tables from their names. But now I will explain them in basic. But you will understand much better when we see all the data in them in our further lectures. The base table of the schema is employees table. Since this schema is human resources schema, all the tables in them are related with the employees. So the base table is employees. This table has the base information about the employees like employee IDs, first names, last names, emails, etc. All these fields represents the columns of that table. So employee ID is a column, first name is another column, etc. You see some of these columns written as blue. These are colored with blue because they are the primary keys. You will see the primary keys in details in further lectures in this course, but for now I can say that primary keys are the IDs of each record and they are unique. With these columns, we will be sure that we store a data for only once. But here we think primary keys as the columns that we establish connections with the other tables. If you look at the department ID column in employees table, and if we look at the department ID column in departments table, we will simply understand that we establish the relations between these two tables with using these columns. Okay, no need to go deeper for primary keys. So let's continue with explaining the tables. The second table is departments table. This table has the data of the departments. We have the department ID column as the primary key here, then department name, manager ID, location ID columns. Assume that we have a department here with the ID of 100 and the name of this department is called as executive. If we set the department ID column of employees table as 102, this means that employee works in the department with the ID of 100. And in the departments table, we can understand that that department is the executive department. As you can see, it is simple actually. The next table is locations. Each department must have a location, and departments and locations tables are connected to each other with the location ID columns. The other columns of locations are street address, postal code, city, state province, and country ID columns. The next table is the countries table. I will not explain all the connections of each table between each other, but you can see that these dashed lines represent the connections of the tables among each other. And these three angular lines, which looks like a bird foot, represent one-to-many relationships. Actually, I did not explain relation types yet, but for now I can say that this is called as one-to-many relationship. That means, for example, in here, there can be many locations using a single ID of countries. I mean, let's say that if one of the country ID is 50, for example, there can be one or many locations whose country ID is set to 50. Actually, we saw that in the previous lectures. Employees table have multiple same department IDs. You will understand better when you see the examples in the further lectures. The next table is regions. This table simply has the regions of countries. The next table is jobs table. This table has the definitions of jobs and minimum and maximum salaries of that specific job. The last table is job history table. This table has the history of employees in their jobs. An employee can work in different jobs, and all this history is stored in this table. This might be complicated for you for now, but throughout the course, you will understand every details of the subjects what I mentioned. So this is the end of HR user schema lesson. See you in the next lectures.